Hi there, and welcome to this session, which covers the 4 rules for composing applications. In this session, we'll discuss the 4 rules, which include correctly layering an application's modules, correctly layering the applications themselves, and then not mixing owners and not mixing sponsors. Now, we'll try to understand these rules a little bit better by looking at a quality control example, which we've seen in other types of architecture sessions. And we'll use this sample to go ahead and look at the application composition decisions that could be made. So let's get started. Two of the key concepts that we need to understand are that of applications and application layers. These concepts will be familiar if you've completed the Designing Applications course. An application is a set of modules. We define the application and the modules inside of Service Studio. Applications are the minimum deployment unit for the lifetime management tool, and applications can have different versions of the application deployed to the various environments in the infrastructure. Now, applications can also be placed into the 4 layers of the architecture canvas. Which layer we place the application in depends on the modules inside that application. The application layer that an application belongs to is the topmost layer for any of the modules inside of that application. So in each of the examples to the right, we can see that the top level module in the application defines the layer that that application is placed in. So here we can see an orchestration module. So this application becomes an orchestration application. There are also in user modules and core modules in this application, but we think of it as an orchestration application because the module with the highest layer can have the largest effect on that overall application. So now that we know how to correctly layer applications onto the canvas, let's go ahead and look at some of the rules. The first rule is to correctly layer the application's modules. There should be no upward references, no references among orchestration or end user modules, and no cycles between modules. This is the same guidance that we covered in the first course and is the best practices for correctly designing applications. The second rule is correctly layering the applications according to those exact same principles of no upward references, no references in orchestration or end user applications, and no cycles among applications. So we're trying to do the same thing where the applications have now been placed in the correct layer of the canvas, and we're applying the exact same rules. It's probably easier if we look at a quick example that might demonstrate how these principles can apply to applications as well. So let's imagine that we have a project and we've built a number of modules to provide certain functionality to end users. The modules are following our guiding principles and we have a solid architecture. At the end of the day, we wish to be able to deploy these modules from our development environment to QA into production. So we can place all the modules in an end user application so it can be more easily deployed. And when you're working on your first project, you're probably focused on delivering the functionality, so bundling all of the modules into a single application makes sense. Now, a second project comes along and it requires different functionality. So the modules have a different structure and can be placed inside of a second application. So far, so good, because each of these applications has a solid architecture and there are no references or relationships between the applications or any of the modules in those applications. Now, the whole point of placing different libraries and different core services into their own modules is to make them easier to reuse in the future, but at this point, none of the applications need or are sharing any of the modules that are there. So We could imagine a request from the business to add some information provided by Core C to end user 1 application, and potentially add some services and information from the core service B to the end user 2 application, which might end up looking like this. Now we have references to the other core services that have become part of the requirements for our third project. Now in terms of module architecture, everything is okay. But if we come over here and we begin to look at the application composition, we see that we now have a cyclical reference. Because in terms of the applications, application 1 will need information from Core C, and application 2 will need information from Core B. So basically what we need to do is apply the same principles we thought about from a module perspective to these applications. And we need to extract the reusable modules and place them inside of their own application. So one way to solve this problem would be to keep end user application information that isn't shared separate for application 1 and application 2, but move all of the shared components to a new application that we might call the core application. Because we need core services B and core services C, and they depend on their libraries, library B and library C, we would move all of those components to a new application. By refactoring the application, we now have a sound architecture from an application standpoint as well. Basically what we're saying in Rule 2 is that we need to apply the same guiding principles to our applications that we did to our modules. So this is just kind of reinforcing what we want from a module perspective on the application layer as well. The third rule is to avoid mixing owners of applications. Let's imagine that we have an application with a number of modules that have two different owners who are responsible for the functionality in the modules. If we need to deploy this application, we may not be sure who to ask to guarantee that it's safe to deploy the whole application. So we need to ask both owners. It would be better to promote ownership between the different modules so that each functionality is owned by one of the different owners. So we could split the common application into two applications that clearly defines who owns which modules and which sets of functionality. Similarly, the fourth rule is to avoid mixing sponsors. In this example, we have an application that provides simulators to different lines of businesses through a simulation portal. The portal gives us access to auto, life, and property types of simulators, and that portal will allow those different lines of business to go ahead and get access to their core business concepts. There's also some simulation or calculation engine that is helping understand the different policies around these different types of concepts. But in this case, the auto business wishes to modify their components or one of the engines, and that would require us to go ahead and deploy these modules. Unfortunately, these different lines of business can now affect each other. So what needs to happen is that we should split this large application into several smaller applications, which can then be aligned with the line of business that is sponsoring that application. So in this case, the auto business would be aligned with the auto application, the life with the life application, and the property with the properties. Each line of business could now be deployed independently, and they would just be sharing the common calculation engines and policies. But this provides more independence because each line of business can determine the rate and the pace at which it needs to update its own sets of functionality. So this example begins to get to things that are more complicated and make sense to kind of separate pieces of applications to make deployments easier. If we go back and think about the relatively complex example that we looked at called the equal application, and started thinking about all of the work that it does and how we could compose the applications into something easier to manage, we could look at the details of the example again. And if you remember, we had three main business processes. We had a recall process, we had a supplier audit process, and we had a store audit process. Information about these processes were going to be exposed through a back office portal, an equal portal, and a supplier portal. There was also going to be core services that were necessary to go ahead and support all of these processes. And then these core services got some of their information from an ERP system. There were also different color schemes and looks and feels to the different portals that were being provided. Now, in terms of application composition, we would not want to package all of this into one huge application, because we'd be losing the capability to evolve different parts of this application at different rates or in different life cycles for how some of these services need to evolve. So what we'd want to do is package the different sets of modules into applications that would minimize the impact that changing any one application would have on the other components of other applications. So we might start by packaging the components of the processes together, and then also making sure that all of the core services would be together. We might also want to make sure that the different looks and feels would be inside of the same application, because they might be managed by the same group of people and the same owner as to how things will look for those applications. So this is one way to break up all of the modules that might be associated with this large solution that we were talking about earlier. There are other ways that things might get broken up. We might decide that some of these core services are actually owned by different parts of the business, and they need to go ahead and be separated into different applications. We want to make sure that we have the flexibility of changing these things as needed. So this is an important thing to be able to do. But we also don't want to take it too far and actually get to the point where every single module is placed in its own application, because then we have a lot more applications to deploy and to worry about as part of the overall solution. So in review, in this session we talked about the 4 rules for composing applications. We looked at how we need to layer the application modules first, then layer the applications themselves, and try to make sure that we don't mix any types of owners or sponsors that may have different life cycles or different paces. We looked at the equal quality control example again, and looked at some of the different ways that application composition decisions can be made. So that's it for the 4 rules for composing applications. Thanks for listening.